Welcome, OCAPLTA. We are Land Information Services. We're going to do a webinar for you today on acquisition implementation.
Well, I'm Wade Brawley. I'm founder and Chief Executive Officer of Land Information Services, and I'll present the first session and then lateral to my teammates here.
Hi, I'm Jim Shaw. I'm the President and COO. I'll be coming in after Wade and talking about data requests and things like that to look for during the implementation process.
And I'm Amy Hopman, Director of Land Processes and also the past president this year for OCAPLTA.
I'm Drew Hopkins. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Land Information Services, and I will be doing a portion on owner relations and how we get the information that we need.
Okay. So to start off, I always like to know where we came from and where we're going to. So while we're talking about acquisition implementation, I prepared kind of just a rudimentary timeline on how that all happens. So, the first thing that happens is there's a data room. You're reviewing data to determine, do you even want to make this acquisition? Then there's the PSA negotiating the purchase and sale agreement. And there's a lot of detail there that we're not going to go into, but you just need to be aware of where that lies in the process. But it's often during the PSA that you're going to be requesting the data that you're going to receive and hand off to your technicians, your specialists to convert the data. So it's really important that they keep everyone in tune, that the negotiators keep everyone in tune with what's going on, and keep in mind the concerns that everyone down the line on that timeline has, so they can make sure and enter that into the PSA. Followed by due diligence. After the due diligence, you're going to find exceptions, title issues, cash flow problems that were misrepresented perhaps, and then so there's some negotiation or settlement on that. Then you're closing. Then there's a TSA period. So the seller might temporarily manage your processes for you. Then there's the data transfer. So that's finally when you get the data. It's pretty late in the timeline. Then there's the post-close, and then there's always work in progress. So that's just basically the timeline. And again, note where the data conversion comes in towards the end, but we really need to be aware of what's going on the front end of that timeline, to be aware, to be prepared, and to schedule time necessary to convert your agreements and your wells and owners and DOIs. So a few things to take into consideration are land transactions. So early on in the process, there should be a discussion of what are your AMI obligations? What am I taking on here? What do I have to offer to other partners when I make an acquisition within this acquisition I'm buying? Any kind of current trades and negotiations in progress. What happens often is there are assignments that have not been delivered to your seller, and they should be made aware of that. So it's always a good point to bring up with the seller, because it's a good reminder that, oh yeah, I better get that done. So we always like to know, what are your pending assignment obligations into the seller and out of the seller. They might have negotiated a farm out and they owe an assignment to someone. Any kind of current litigation, any kind of remediation they're doing, got to be aware of that, and that should have taken place during the data room review and certainly during due diligence. Any wells currently drilling, not an issue lately, but still should be on the list, and there could be workovers pending. And then any kind of conservation hearings, applications that are pending, important to go over those. During that TSA process, it normally is going to cover just your back office, the lease records, division orders, accounting, mostly accounting. It does not usually cover those land transactions. That's normally going to be passed on to the buyer for them to make their elections and their decisions. Next to talk about would be regulatory and contractual obligations. Hopefully, if you're already operating as a buyer of properties, you already have your bonds in place, an operator bond for each state. Sometimes that's not always the case, so that's a pre-closing requirement that you should take care of. For each state, if you have state-owned lands, additional bonding requirements. Federal lands, again, additional bonding requirements. And then for the actual leases. If you have federal, state, or Indian leases, there's additional bonding there. So you need to be aware of those, be prepared so that you don't delay any kind of transition in the implementation process. Communitization agreements, certainly pref rights, make sure those have been all identified, as well as consents to assign. This all happens pre-closing, and the seller should be very involved in these, but oftentimes it's the buyer that has to issue the letters requesting consent to assign.
Additionally, on the federal lands, if they're not already owning any federal leases, they need to get set up with the ONRR and get their payor number.
Right.
That's sometimes a lengthy process.
Yeah, so another good point to make. So there's a lot that goes into these acquisition implementations other than just the data conversion, which is a huge task in itself. Then there's the change of operator form. That needs to be taken care of. Now, a lot of times the seller will take control of that, but again, it needs to be on your list of transition items so that it's not overlooked and so that the seller is held accountable for their part of the transition. Then there are going to be notices that need to be sent out. First, there's a notice to the operator to let them, and usually the seller will prepare that because they're pretty anxious to let the operators know that they shouldn't send the JIB to them anymore. It goes to the new buyer. So they usually will send that out and offer to send that. But notice to the non-operators, while I think the operator should be, the seller should be involved in that process. Oftentimes they shed that responsibility. They want the buyer to do that. But I think it's important that they be involved because they're the operator of record. They actually need to resign as operator. But what we're finding lately is a lot of operators are hesitant to nominate or recommend the buyer of the property as the successor operator. So they're just leaving that whole process to the successor operator or to the buyer, who is hopefully the successor operator. And then what happens after that is if someone disagrees, there's a more formal balloting process that ensues. There is then a letter in lieu. Obviously, the seller has got to be involved in that because they have to sign off on that. So that would be a notification to the operators and the purchasers that all remittances should go to the new company, the buyer. And then the notice to owners. So again, as you enter into an acquisition, it should be very clear who's responsible for what. Try and push as much off to the seller as you can, but be aware that some of this you'll just have to assume as the buyer. You'll have to assume the responsibility and just take care of it. But all of these notifications are extremely important, and the timing is important as well. So for example, your notice to your non-operators must take place before you set foot on that property to operate it. So if your operations began effective September 1, then your notification to the non-operators should go out no later than August 15th. Your notice to the owners, on the other hand, should wait till the last possible moment so they're not contacting you prematurely. So if your first revenue distribution is going to be in, let's say November 25th, you don't want to send that notice until after the seller has made their last distribution on October 25th. So sometime in that 30-day window, you need to send out your notification that explains who's responsible for remittances from here on out. There'll be no interruption. Who do you contact if you want to notify us of a change of address or what have you? And Drew's going to talk about more of that later. But we often find a lot of deferred maintenance, and there's a lot of address changes and transfers of interest that occur right after you close. So it's really important to direct those people so that their information goes to the right address, the right email address, so that you can quickly resolve that in your first month of implementation.
You don't necessarily want to give the owners any additional incentive or opportunity to contact. They're going to contact you anyways.
That's exactly
You don't need another reason.
Exactly. A lot of companies use it as sort of a marketing ploy. I mean, just to kind of reinforce their abilities as an operator, and welcome to the XYZ operating company family, and we treat our owners right, and they'll do that because they want to maybe buy their minerals somewhere down the road. So they want to start off on a good foot, and that's always important, no matter what size company you are. Start off on the right foot by assuring them no disruption in revenue, remittance, and we're easy to be in touch with. We're easy to contact. Some other considerations, not necessarily having to do with land administration, but gas marketing arrangements. Some systems are pretty sophisticated, and the marketing file is integrated with the DOIs. So division orders is who is impacted mostly by this information. So if you're a larger company, likely you'll have a gas marketing person or department who will take care of this, but it's really important that it be on your list of data information to receive and to integrate with your daily processes. So it's something we rely on very heavily in division orders, as well as the gas balancing statements, just to make sure that that is transitioned to the new buyer, the most recent statement. And in the transition agreement with your seller, there'll be a requirement of when they'll deliver that final set of statements. So it's important that you hold them accountable to delivering those so that you can add on or continue the gas balance process. And then payout cases. Again, this is something that impacts mostly division orders because we'll want to see that, do we have after payout DOIs? Do we need to create them? Do we have DOIs that are going to need to be reworked because payout has just occurred or is about to occur? So again, your accounting department is probably aware and should be requesting not only the payout balances, but the detail. Why did the payout case occur? Was it a workover? Was it a recompletion? Was it the drilling of the well? Who's non-consent? Who's farmed out? You need to know those details, and your accounting department should have a case file for each of those. But at the same time, your division order department should be aware of those, so you know what kind of division order work you'll have ahead of you. And then work in progress. So your TSA agreements, I wouldn't expect that they would do much in the way of lease records. Do you, Amy?
No.
Have they ever?
We generally find the maintenance. They've moved on.
Yeah. So lease records, we don't really count on anything. So we usually recommend that we go ahead and get the data and get started on that conversion. But division orders and certainly accounting, they are expected to do that. What we find sometimes, though, is in division orders, they don't always timely handle the transfers. So it's good to stay in touch, make contact with division order analyst to division order analyst, not your business development manager. Someone who is in the weeds working with them, working in that same trench, so that they can understand, hey, please get this done so it doesn't all fall on me. And usually sellers they intend to do as much of that as they can. They want to take care of that and get all that out the door, and be noted as a good operator and a good partner. But still, always good to be aware of what that backlog is like. I always ask in the very beginning, what is the backlog like? Are you 30 days behind, 60 days behind? And just that question will usually prompt them to, I guess I better get to work on this. That will usually motivate them to work ahead and minimize that backlog. And then you have to consider, well, how will work in progress come to me? Will you be sending me a delta of what's changed during that transition period? Or will you be giving me just all of your DOIs and I have to figure out for myself what's different? You need to make that clear how that's going to be communicated. Or will you just give me a hard copy or an image of whatever you receive from owners, address changes, etc. So there's a lot to consider there in work in progress, and that shouldn't be overlooked. During the TSA, and then after the TSA ends, there's still going to be work that they receive that they need to hand over to the buyer. So it's important to establish that method of how that work is going to be delivered over. Anything else I've overlooked? Some important points?
I think receiving some of the owner detail. Eventually some of these owners are going to have to be escheated to the state, and having that backup is really important too.
That's a good point about suspense. Is suspense included? Is it not? It's different. It's about 50-50.
Yeah.
I generally would recommend that you leave the suspense with the seller because it's really a liability. You pay interest on it, and you have to manage it and try and get rid of it, and then, like you said, eventually it's cheated. But sometimes operators or sellers want to get rid of it for that very reason. So you have to take it. I think years ago, buyers were thinking, oh, here's a couple of $1 million I can just kind of have in my coffers, and why not? Well, there's a price to that couple of $1 million, and so they try to usually leave that suspense with the seller if they can. So thank you for listening, and we'll continue the discussion after we take a short break.
Hi everyone, again my name is Jim Shaw. I'm the President and COO of Land Information Services. Today we're going to be talking about the data requests that you're going to make throughout the implementation process behind an acquisition.
My name is Rich Cratcher. I'm the project manager here at LIS.
I'm Mason Bryan. I'm a data hygienist here at LIS.
So we're going to go over kind of what to ask for, how do you structure a team that's responsible for running this implementation on the data side, some of the technical things that you may do to get the data from one place to another, and then testing and validating that data at the end of the day. So a few different questions that you should ask up front whenever you meet with the seller is, first we need to establish what systems do they have, what source system do they have for land, accounting, any kind of well master data management, production accounting, what do they use for their GIS infrastructure. There's a host of questions that you can apply there, and it even extends beyond just the regular system of record. What type of workflow applications do they have? If this is a full kind of asset sale, you don't want to ask for too much where you're maybe insulting them a little bit or being a little greedy with your request, but at the same time you don't want to leave anything on the table. But knowing what systems they're currently on, for example, on the land side, is it a track-based system versus an agreement-based system? A lot of those things are going to come into play when you start to receive that data and transform it into your environment, depending upon what type of land system you have. So you have to make sure that you get a full roster and inventory of all the systems that you're going to be working with, and making sure that it kind of seems like a no-brainer, but you want a full extract from that system, an actual database extract from the land system, the accounting system, what have you. You don't really want to rely on Excel spreadsheets or reports that can be generated from the front end of those systems. While they often generate a lot of data and a lot of content, it's not going to be completely comprehensive. So there's other, child tables and data squirreled away in other places within those environments that often don't come out in those reports or those exports. So you want to make sure that you're getting a full raw data extract, and at the same time, maybe request a few front-end exports just so you can more easily validate the data once it comes through, because when it's in its raw form and you start to translate it and put it into a different form that fits your system, it's nice to kind of see a clean report from the seller's system, so you can easily compare and contrast, once you get it into your environment. So don't ignore the front-end export request, but those should be secondary, in terms of the data conversion, just for validation purposes. So once you kind of take stock of all of the systems that you're going to be converting from a structured data standpoint, now we can talk about unstructured data, which is going to be your documents. These are your PDFs, your images, the attachments that link to records within those various systems. Your lease images, your well images, contracts, owners, and what have you. So those are often stored, hopefully, in some type of document management system, where they're in a controlled environment. They're organized by type of document. They're easily linked to those various records: a lease number, a well number, a contract number. But I would also encourage people to, pose the question of, do you have any kind of department folders on your network drive that land is using, where they're storing, JOAs or DPUs that are in a file, on their shared drive that haven't yet been set up as a contract in the land system, I would encourage to ask that question. A lot of the times the seller is going to not want to provide images from just a department folder because there could be other things there, but you may be able to come to a compromise on asking them to at least kind of scrub that a little bit and give you some meaningful documents that you otherwise wouldn't get from the document management system or some other repository. And then, another big item is shape files. So most sellers will have some form of GIS environment, especially if you're dealing with a larger operator. And it should go well beyond just your lease layer or just the well spots. I would ask for any kind of layers that they're managing within GIS, certainly leases and wells and contracts, but what about pipelines? What about right-of-ways? What about facilities or pad sites or, some type of other third-party data vendor layer, which you probably won't get, but, at minimum, you need to have a good list of layers that maybe you manage yourself internally that you would expect somebody else, of the same caliber to be managing, and make sure you're not shortchanged on the amount of GIS data and layers that you would get. So, we've kind of listed out a little bit of the systems that we're going to be asking, for information and extracts. And once we start to receive that information, it comes through in a lot of different methods, right? Mm-hmm. So depending upon the size and volume of the transaction and the amount of data, there could already be a data room in place through the pre-close checklist that Wade mentioned, maybe through a VDR. Maybe there's an FTP site already set up or some other method of transmittal where you can receive that data. And a lot of the times, especially on the documents, we're getting so many documents that external hard drives are even easier to deal with for the recipient, for you, the buyer, to receive, so you can more easily pull that information down and not have to go over the wire on an FTP site. So the medium of transmittal of that data is something you need to establish up front too, so you can make sure that everybody's on the same page of how the data is going to flow over. But once that data starts flowing over, Reggie, can you describe to us a little bit about the team that the buyer should have in place from a technical standpoint that is going to be responsible for receiving that data and working with it and getting it organized in their environment?
Yeah, absolutely. We're down there responsible for the database infrastructure to make sure we have everything in place. So we have our data hygienist, which Mason is, a couple of data analysts. So once we receive all the data, we review the data, put together a project plan, and what I'm responsible for is putting together that project plan, making sure we're sticking to the schedule, making sure we're following the requirements set out and those given by the client. Also, like I said, making sure we're sticking to the schedule, making sure we're on budget, which is extremely important. I understand for the clients because we don't want to be spending too much of their money, right? So that's a big thing.
Even within E&P organizations going through an acquisition, that costs time to absorb that acquisition. So you allocate resources, to run that conversion process and get the information into your system, and
right.
And it should be part of the overall cost of the acquisition. So yeah, there's the DBA like you mentioned, data hygienists like Mason that are responsible for cleansing that data and getting it into that environment. So can you, Mason, talk to us a little bit about the process that you go through when you get your hands on the data for the first time, and how do you take it from that structure and get it into the structure that the company's using?
Sure. So typically we get our extracts. They're going to be usually in an Excel format, but like you said, it's not the front end Excel export from the system. It's going to be a full download of the back end, all the tables, code tables. And typically what we do is we will scan through the data to make sure that we have everything there, whether it's agreements, contracts, well information, owner information, and we will go in and just start mapping the fields to match kind of what our system uses. Once we get those field codes mapped, we'll go through the codes, make sure we have the corresponding codes, if not the same codes, and run counts on those. How many fee records do we have? How many federal? How many Indian? And we usually send that, once we get that full number, we'll send it to the lease records department, Amy, and we'll delegate it out to kind of check off, make sure everything's looking the way it needs to be looked, make sure the code mapping's the way it needs to be. Once we get that data and everything code mapped, that's when we kind of start piecemealing everything together, checking for anything with tracks that need to be broken out. With LandVantage, we have it where one section per track, whereas some databases use multi-legal sections, which we can't handle or we don't do currently.
Right.
And so checking those to make sure that breaks out correctly. We run some more QCs on the front end, making sure that we're not missing anything, whether it's agreement dates or interest or anything of that sort. And then once we kind of get all that together into a template for LandVantage, we then push it into SQL, run our tests. We have a bunch of checks in our database that also check for, orphaned leases or orphaned tracks, orphaned wells. So there's a lot of QCing while we're going through the data to ensure that we're getting the best cut of data, make sure there's not anything potentially needed that is missing.
Yeah, and when you go through, and jumping back to that field and code mapping process, you could be dealing with, a seller that maybe it was a little too easy for them to add a new code to their system, and so there's a lot of codes, and a lot of them really mean the same thing, and so there's redundancy there that you discover during the code mapping process. You can say, well, these 3 codes really mean the same one code in our system. So you don't want to take just the seller's codes at face value and stick them into your system. There's really an important evaluation process there. And then even from a field mapping standpoint, some systems treat data in a different way, and there could be custom fields that they've created in their previous environment that you haven't contemplated. So how do we absorb that data? So there's a good opportunity during that kind of discovery phase with the data to make sure that you find those inefficiencies. You make sure they go into your system correctly and completely, that you don't leave any data behind. I mean, that's a huge possibility that you get somebody that says, well, I don't really know what that means, or that column name doesn't really line up with what I see over here, so we're just going to leave it there. Well, there's probably meaningful data there, meaningful information. So you got to make sure that nothing gets left behind, and then you get the information into your environment. And another part of the process that we talked about earlier today was, typically on the lease records or the land data side, you really only get one cut of data. There's not a lot of deferred maintenance or ongoing maintenance rather that is going to be conducted during the transition or during the implementation process. So you usually just get one cut of data, which is nice, but with the accounting data, with DAs and DOIs and all of that information, it is much more evergreen and changing quite frequently. So you do get multiple cuts of information. So your data team needs to be prepared to absorb the first cut of data and then be prepared for the next round. And is it trunk and load, or is it just deltas, and make sure that you're set up to handle that through your scripting process that you've developed in SQL or what have you. So, but it's extremely important for the team, this data team and application team, to have very immediate access to the business user. So somebody in lease records, be it a supervisor or a coordinator or a senior analyst, that's going to be in charge of that area or of that asset. The data hygienist needs to have direct access and collaboration with that person to make sure, like you said, that the way that we're mapping the codes in the fields is in line with how they expect to see the data come over. Gives that person in lease records a little more ownership of that asset as it comes through the door. So that's a huge benefit that maybe you need somebody like a business analyst that sits in between those two people, or maybe they can collaborate directly, and that's totally fine. But that collaboration absolutely has to happen, so you don't go through this whole long process potentially of weeks or months to get this information into the system, And then all of a sudden your business users are going, well, that doesn't look right.
Yeah.
Or why did you put that here? Why did we code this remark that way? Or why is the provision, structured that way? And then you got to go back to the drawing board and redo a bunch of stuff. So that is, how we recommend that you approach from a data standpoint, how you request the information, the team that you should have kind of prepared and ready from a technical standpoint to absorb that data, implement it, test it, and absolutely along the way making sure you have constant collaboration between your tech and your business users, so there's no confusion and it's fully transparent. But thank you all so much for joining us and listening to what we had to talk about on the data request for this acquisition implementation segment. Thank you.
After the conversion process gets started, then we're going to move into user acceptance testing, data cleansing, and post-conversion exercises. Joining us today is Summer. She is one of our coordinators at Land Information Services, and she has been really instrumental in part of the implementation process for conversions. And Shay, she is a data hygienist who is largely responsible for a lot of the conversions here. So during our agreements, so this is going to include contracts and leases, some of the big data points that we check on are going to be comparing our assignments.
All right, so we'll take assignments. What I like to do is export what we've got in the system, compare it to what we've been provided, try to compare numbers, total number of agreements, and then start looking at, make sure interests are totaling the same, acreage.
Yeah, acreage and interest totals, those are always big fast wins, and find best in the data really quick.
Right.
Another one is going to be a payment and obligation calendars, and making sure we get those projections from the sellers from in our initial data loads. That's going to be really important to make sure we've got everything converted correctly, make sure we have all the payments set up correctly, all the dates.
Yeah, those are very important. I don't want to miss the payment, so yeah, it's very important.
Definitely. So, and how about the wells? You're really active in the well conversions.
Same with the wells. I like to do exports again and make sure my total number of wells entered is what's on the data provided, and interest is comparing same number of tracks, formations are entered correctly.
A lot of times we don't get a lot of really good source data on
Sure.
wells.
Sure.
So we have to go out and use GIS and public sources to kind of infill a lot of data. So that's another thing to think about when you are doing an acquisition and you don't get really good data. Use those public source data, and if you've got your APIs, you can usually go out and get production dates, different things like that. And a lot of times we only get the surface hole location, and so we have to go out and find the bottom hole locations and allocation factors where it's applicable to.
Yes, getting good data is very important.
Very important.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the questions come too, if you don't get all the data the first time corresponding back to the client, and making sure that what their request is what we're doing. If they just want active wells, we'll do active wells and then match everything back up as we load it in.
And one thing that's really important is the timing too, right? Because there's a certain point in time that the seller is like, I'm not providing any more information.
Yes.
So we need to discover these things early on so that we can instruct the buyer to go back to the seller and make these requests. So like Summer, don't you find that sometimes you look at all the data and if you compare that to the assignment exhibit, it doesn't always match, does it?
No, it does not always match. Yes, it can be very, very frustrating at times, but as long as you use the sources that you have to fix it.
So I mean, sometimes it's an opportunity, right? So if they send you data that's not on the assignment, maybe it was supposed to be on the assignment, and that's where there's a value added to our client, the buyer, to say, you need to get this assignment because there is additional land that was intended to be in the assignment, or it could have been intentionally left off. But
Right.
we have an obligation to let them know this is the delta.
Same thing with images too. So a lot of times we'll get metadata or not enough images or vice versa. So
Right.
that's another opportunity to have those relationships with the seller and buyer.
So it gets really hairy when you have to reconcile the images with the data and then also with the assignment. And it'd be wonderful if they matched, but they don't. They
Rarely
never
match.
did. And
Well,
they're
just
three different
provided.
deltas.
I mean, a lot of the images are not provided either, so that
Right.
makes it really difficult too.
So that's a real challenge. But again, it's a value add that we provide so that the buyer can go back to the seller if they need to, or realize, oh, we got a bonus here. Or we need this data, it's on the assignment, we didn't get the data or the images. So, very important. And it usually happens with the agreements, not as much the wells.
Yeah.
Right, sure.
Because everyone's kind of well focused. I mean, that's the hub of all the information, right? To the wells is cross-referenced the agreements and the owners and the DOIs. It's so critical. So it's really one of the early conversion master files, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we make sure we have those wells in first and as much data as we can and scrape public sources if we can. And then
Owners and
traditional
DOIs.
owners. Yeah. So you might explain some of the challenges you've had in reconciling DOIs with wells. Once the wells are set up,
Once
we
the
have
wells are-
well numbers.
Then it's making sure all the wells have a corresponding DOI. And even in the DOI, making sure all of our owners, our BAs, are unique and that we don't have multiple owners set up in our system. Then we have different owners on different decks, different wells. So it's just inconsistency that we like to just notice and upfront get that in and loaded correctly the first time.
Right.
So we've got a lot of that going on. Getting all of the wells, just making sure that those wells and DOIs match up. We don't have any that don't have a DOI, going back to the client and making sure that we get that.
Right. And we'll maybe kind of dive into that a bit more in a minute. But that first step is once you have those wells, bringing the DOIs, the JIB DOIs, the revenue DOIs, making sure for every well we have one of those DOIs.
Yes.
And sometimes with the DOI information, you end up with more wells than you expect.
Yes.
And they could be inactive, they could be oversights. A lot of times, it's an active well, but it's just a marginal well, and so it just doesn't end up on their schedule. So they kind of forget, oh yeah, you get that one too.
Yeah.
So during the conversion process, you find a lot of extra data that needs to go into the system that they overlook in the BSA.
Sure.
So one thing.
Sorry.
No,
Even
you go ahead.
comparing our JIB and our revenue decks to each other, making sure our working interest owners are on both of the decks, making sure we tie that way as well, and not just necessarily back to the well,
Right.
just
Right.
tying to each other.
So before we even begin this process, one of the important steps to take is to look at their accounting system. So if we're going from a middle tier system to a middle tier system, like say, Wolfpack, Inertia to OGSys or whatever, it's fairly easy. I shouldn't say that. You're supposed to elbow me when I say that. It's not as challenging as going, say, from SAP, which is a very sophisticated, complex system, to a simplistic system. So in SAP, for example, you have not only your DOIs, but you've got a purchaser cross-reference file, you've got a marketing file that integrates with the DOIs, with the revenue processing. A lot of this automation that is not available in some of the middle tier systems. So you have to be aware of that and make allowances. So SAP may have just one basic DOI, which is all of the ownership, and it's everything you're ever going to need. It's great, right? It has all the bearer groups, that's 100%. And the distribution of revenue occurs dynamically. So as the revenue comes in, because SAP recognizes that purchaser and it knows through the marketing file who's participating with that purchaser, it dynamically builds a DOI. Well, when you don't have SAP, you have to anticipate that and manually build that DOI, which is what we have to do a lot in conversions. So it's really important to know what kind of accounting system are you going from and going to, and do they have a purchaser cross-reference? Do they have a marketing file? Are there bearer groups? A lot of times you'll have to convert into a system that doesn't have bearer groups. Really important information that you still need to retain offline and find a way to best store that data that can't go into the accounting system that still should be available to your land and DOI division order departments. Understand their DOI numbering convention. Do their numbers have meaning, for like after payout or special circumstance DOIs, blowout prevention, LOE decks versus general LOE decks, etc. Really important to understand all that so nothing gets missed and no one gets billed incorrectly. Mapping your product codes, pay codes, suspense reason codes, yes, very important. So a lot of that is preliminary work before we even dive into converting the DOIs. And then, like you said, reconciling the DOIs with the wells. And then it's really important to, a critical step is to work with the BA. So getting their BA master, and the first thing I like to do is identify what I call priority owners. So that would be your state owners, your federal OR&R, but also identify all the related parties to the seller. So it could be ABC oil company that you're acquiring, but they may have ABC1, ABC2 as these other related entities that you're supposed to also receive their interest. A lot of time this information doesn't make it from the person who negotiates the deal to the person converting the data. So you really need to know, hey, who are my priority owners? Who's selling in this DOI? So you find all those to map to your buyer. But also an opportunity is your buyer may have a lot of related entities that the seller wasn't aware of. So you might find where there were conveyance or transfers that should have been made by the seller to you, but weren't, or where they had your name wrong or something. So there's an opportunity there to clean up the data that they're giving to you that pertains to your prior interest. So doing that, and then identifying duplicate owners, and that's where the fun begins, right, Shay?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of times when companies are in acquisition mode, they're just dumping that into their source system, and
Yeah.
you find a lot of duplicates, and it causes a problem after many years.
So, some companies just convert it as is. It's like, we don't have time to go through this, but you pay for it later. So I think if you can just be very careful and devote a little bit of time to cleaning that up, it's really worthwhile. So first of all, there's the duplicates within the seller's data. They may have Chesapeake in there, for example, 5 different times because of all the entities and the confusion that might have been caused. Find all those opportunities to combine those owners. So once you've combined all of and another thing, in many companies, they might have one owner number for the revenue deck, another owner number for the billing deck, even though it's the same company.
And another one for land payments.
Yes, yeah. So identify all those and bring them together. And so, Shay, you've had to create like a cross-reference table, right? That shows all of these owners have these different numbers, but it's now this one number.
One number. We created a master BA.
Right. So once you do that, now you have to compare it with your buyer's data, right? Because they may have some of the same owners. And so we do that 2 different ways. First of all is by tax ID number, and then by syntax, a similar name, because maybe the tax ID number is wrong or missing or something. But here's the interesting thing. So we find ABC company in their data and ABC company in our existing data. So you think, oh, I'll just map this number to my number and we're done. But you really have to compare the address too, right?
Correct.
Because in my company, the buyer's company, maybe the last time I made a payment to ABC company was 10 years ago. Whereas my seller company has been making monthly payments. Probably their information is better than my information. So it goes into a file, if you will, that I'm mapping this number to this number and I'm updating this number. In other cases, I'm mapping this number to this number because it's a good match. And then you have a third bucket, which is these are all the new ones and they get a new number. So really very tedious.
Very.
But very important.
That's to go back to understanding the data, receiving clean data, and cleaning it up before you start putting it into the system is huge time. I mean, it is time consuming in the front end, but it saves you so much from the back end.
Not only that, and we'll talk about this with owner relations, that if you get it right, you avoid the phone calls.
Yes. Some.
So that's important. So keep in mind everyone downstream who will be working with the information you're generating. How reliable is it, and will they be able to represent to owners correct information? So some value add things that can be done that there's not always time to do, but I highly recommend, is you take all of the owners that you converted and you look at the pay status for all of them. Because a lot of times companies get busy and they may transfer an interest or they may release payment on one well, but they forget there's this other well out there and they forget, and they're still in suspense. So you may find an owner is in pay in all these wells, but for some reason they're in suspense for some unknown reason. And this would be a good opportunity if you have all the information to go ahead and put them in pay status, as long as they're not in suspense for a legal or title type reason. Also find owners who are in suspense in the seller's data, but maybe they were in pay in your data because you had a valid address or you have more information.
That's a good point.
So if you compare that array, then you can identify where you can release owners. You can set them up immediately in pay and not have them in suspense. And that's really an exercise every company should do, regardless of acquisition, is do that array of suspense codes or pay codes to see where you have inconsistencies, because it does happen. No matter how careful your division order department is, it will happen. So doing it during an acquisition implementation, I think is a good opportunity. And then there's the DOI data integrity, which we just talked about, or you mentioned earlier. We find a lot of times the working interest owner in the revenue deck doesn't exist in the billing deck, or vice versa. So it's really important to, with the working interest owner, always compare those BA numbers in the JIB deck and the corresponding revenue deck to make sure that they exist in both. Because if they don't, what happens? We pay one party, and we can't, if they don't pay their bill, we can't net against them. So, and our customers like to net. They like to have their bills paid. So important to compare those working interest owners. And then I like to compare the gas entitlement deck. So in Oklahoma, that'd be your PPI deck, right? So I like to compare to make sure we have the same working interest owners in the PPI deck as the working interest deck, and then compare that with the gas balancing file. If you have earlier on, we talked about receiving that marketing file, who all's taking in kind, the gas balance statements. I would make sure that everyone who's on your taking kind list is in your JIB deck and in your entitlement deck, but they are not in your gas revenue deck. If they're taking in kind, you should not be paying them. So this is an error we find a lot when companies convert, is they disregard that marketing file and they end up setting up an owner who's taking kind, but they're paying them from their gas proceeds. So lots to do, lots of comparisons, lots of different reconciliations that should take place. If you have the payout case file, then that's an opportunity to see, do I have an after payout deck? Oftentimes there are payouts that are occurring right as you're acquiring, and so this may be an opportunity where you need to set up an after payout deck. The problem is, if you wait too long to set up that after payout deck, you end up billing and paying owners a higher interest. Maybe they even go out of title after payout, who knows? And yet you've paid them money, and you have to somehow recoup that. So proactively identifying those payout wells and setting up an after payout deck is really important. So that's why we like to ask for that payout case file early on. Even though it's an accounting function, it impacts division orders, and you can add a lot of value to your company if your division order manager is proactive in that way. What have we left out on DOIs? I think we've exhausted and bored everyone on DOIs. I get a little carried away.
Yeah, a little carried away. No. Well, post-conversion edits is usually what comes up next for us. A lot of times, Shay and others will identify those post-conversion edits for us. Holes in the data where we didn't have, a lot of book and page information, or there's some other things that we've been finding lately.
A lot of missing, just a lot of
royalties,
missing data is a
a
big
lot of
one.
incomplete data.
Or we'll have inconsistencies that will have a drop date but no drop reason, or
Yes.
things like that. That just don't, so we don't know if it's truly dropped or not. So
Yeah, or a lot of mismatched rights type and track statuses, things like that. And a lot of times those have to go in and be converted and look just as is. And then so we call those the post-conversion edits, and we have to go in and do some cleanup there. So a lot of them, things that we find are like past the primary term leases, but there's no well cross-reference to them. So that's a big one that we find.
producing leases,
Producing.
with no well cross reference.
Yes, producing leases with no well cross-references too.
Exactly.
Yes. Also a really good one that I think a lot of people forget about are pews. So is there a pew in the lease? But have they gone back and tracked out those leases? Generally not. We find that maintenance was never done. So that's another really good opportunity for post-conversion. And then reported gross or overlap. That is hugely important, so you're not overstating your gross acres.
Right.
And so there's always a lot of cleanup there. So, and we're seeing a lot of companies using Thought Trace and grouper technologies these days.
Very interesting technology how that happens,
And
but yes, it's
Yeah, and I think a lot of times where these companies come in handy are going to be where you've done an acquisition, but you don't really trust your sellers' provisions and things like that. So it's a really good way to go in and mass review all those provisions and then compare with what was in the seller's data. So a lot of times, especially recently with shut-ins and stuff, a lot of times people didn't trust their shut-in provisions, so they're going back in and looking for the continuous development clauses, things. What other post-conversion edits? Oh,
A lot of the ones that
that's
I've been
the big ones.
dealing with
Yeah.
lately, yes.
Yeah, well status.
Well status. Yeah. Well status is always a big one. Definitely.
You know, and in some systems, there's a substatus, so a well may be producing, but you're not consent, or maybe it's in your system just for information
Yep.
purposes. You have no interest. It's important to identify those and mark those appropriately. Some companies use kind of a combined well status and stage, if you will, status, so they'll just say it's non-consent and that's the status. Well, that's not really
That's
true.
not really
That's
true.
not helpful. It's important to know that it's producing, but it's also a well in which you're non-consent.
Yeah.
So.
That's really important. Well, that's all I can think of today for post-conversion edits. So we'll get Drew to come join us and we'll do some talk about owner relations.
Welcome back. The way that we're going to end our little seminar session today is talking about what we would need on the owner relations side whenever we're looking at what we're getting from the buyer and getting the proper information. Now, through these different sessions that we've done today, we've definitely kind of dabbled in it, and we've talked about the different things that affect owner relations. And it really is one of those things that we look back and we think, what can we do preemptively to kind of curb the number of phone calls or curb the contact that is going to happen, because we know that we are going to get some, and we know that if we plan accordingly, we're going to be ready for that. And there's certain things. I think one of the main things that Wade said earlier was talking about sending out that notice of a new owner or a new company that's owning it. And I remember back in our Chesapeake days, I remember that was the first thing that kind of Wade had tasked our group with, of being able to send those out. And we got to see firsthand how that actually helped and actually affected in a positive way. So the main thing is just that planning and being able to get so many different things really taken care of on the front end. And that is probably getting that new company's information, of that phone number, that email. How are we going to get a hold of those people, right? So what have you all seen kind of going along with that for owners that we needed to get?
Well, I think one of the things we found in some of the recent acquisitions we've helped with is deferred maintenance.
Yeah.
And a lot of bad addresses, a lot of returned mail. So that's been one of the things.
And what a lot of times, whenever these companies, all of a sudden they might get a new check from a new company, and that might be the first thing that they really have ever seen. And I know that we've even heard in our jobs we've had people call us and say, I just received a check from this company. I don't know anything about it. Who is this? And again, like we had talked about earlier, that spurs that click goes in their mind if they say, well, I needed to update my address, or I actually do have I have a mineral deed that I've been sitting on forever that I haven't been able to get a hold of the last company. So this gives me that chance to start all over again and make sure that I get this in. And so what we you'll see about a 25 to 30% increase in owner, I would say, contact by email, by phone. And that's why it is so important on that front end of being able to say, where are they going to go to get that contact? Because if you are that new company and they don't have any way to get a hold of you, it's going to cause so much more problem down the road, aside from them just being able to email and get those documents in and have that expectation of when it's going to be cleared and they're going to be updated in the system.
Yeah, I know with some companies, we've actually sent letters to owners who are in suspense for a bad address, thinking we need to kind of kickstart the research process. And some actually were received, and we did have a good address, but others we were prompted then to research and find them. They were found quite easily, and we were able to put them in pay, and so they were very grateful. And I know that no one in revenue accounting is listening to this, but one thing that I always like to recommend and tell your revenue accounting friends, please, that they always receive revenue payment history so that they can, with that first check run, compare what they're paying out to what that owner has historically been paid. Because it's always possible there could be a bad mapping and you pay the wrong owner, or you overlook someone. So some companies, when they're selling, they will not release that, which is kind of unreasonable, but normally they will release that because they're just as interested in people being paid correctly as the buyer is. So again, I would stress that to do that reconciliation before the first revenue remittance, revenue distribution, is to compare that test file with prior history.
And you spoke earlier about the seller being in charge of that suspense funds, and that just kind of saves them headache as well. Can you kind of tell a little bit more about that, of why that's so important?
Well, I think, again, suspended revenue is a liability. It's not a few $1 million in your coffers that you can use in your operating account.
Right.
It has to be set aside. You have to pay interest on it. You have to manage the escheat process. It's really better if you can leave it with the seller, but it doesn't always work that way. So it's about 50-50 that it stays or it goes. Depends on the transaction, I suppose. But if you are receiving that suspense revenue, then it's important that you perform your due diligence or satisfy yourself that the seller performed due diligence, so that when it comes time to escheat, you can mark off that, yes, I did my due diligence. You should have a way of identifying that due diligence has been performed, whether it be by you or by the prior owner, through maybe a pay code. It could be, escheat, a suspend for escheat and due diligence performed. Have a code for that description.
And be able to tag that owner with your contact attempts too is, I think, important.
For sure. And that kind of brings up one of the things that I've always seen of so many companies out there. Whenever they do make these transactions and they do sell, one of the things that they almost forget to pass along is that previous owner comments of all of the different connections that they've made with those people, to be able to highlight. I want to be very careful the way I say it, but like the high priority owners, the people that need the extra attention, or the people that might be, there may be litigation involved, to be able to have, whether that be an Excel spreadsheet or a, like an owner relations CRM tool, to be able to have that and to be able to pass that on. That's something that's very important. And it can really save not just time, but it can save quite a bit of money as you move on, and the new buyer has that information.
A lot of times the sellers won't release that, but I think it is important to at least attempt to request it with
Right.
your data request.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is this whole planning process, and to your point, it is a planning process, and you're putting things in place, and you have your checklist and you're working on the list, and sometimes the checklist gets ignored or shoved aside because there are more important things. But it's so important to make sure that you hit all of these points, because especially on the owner relations piece, I think like Wade had kind of mentioned it earlier, but there's a whole PR component to owner relations that
There is.
Operators should be very invested and very interested in making sure that they have a good reputation with their landowners, not just with their peers in the industry, but with the people they're actually conducting business with.
I can remember one time I every now and then would sit down on at the owner relations desk and take a call, just so I'd be aware of what the agents were facing. And this lady's talking to me on the phone, and I'm explaining what I can and what I cannot do. I mean, she was asking for things that were kind of unreasonable. And she pauses and she says, don't you think public relations is really an important thing? I had to laugh. I thought, what a great line. She knew what she was asking was maybe not kosher, but it's part of public relations.
That's right. That's right. These are all different things, and where we've got we briefly hit on the escheat funds too. That was one of the ways that I kind of wanted to round this out. And what have we seen by way of when those funds are escheated, being able to mark the accounts, being able to let that buyer know? What else would you say are key elements of what a buyer should ask for or request when dealing with escheat?
Yeah, I really think if you can't get the owner records, the
Right.
owner comments from the previous buyer, then that letter that goes out to the owner really is your first contact. And that's your
Right.
first place you can say, I've made this contact. Once those return mail comes back, you start researching on Accurate or public source data. I think those are really critical to get all of your due diligence done before a sheet.
For sure. There just are so many different ways that you're able to contact, where we're talking about like the different state agencies, the requested data, and to Jim's point of saying this is something that can be a very PR positive for a company. And so to be able to put all of those into a game plan and to be able to look at different ways that you can preemptively make these decisions, make these proper requests, and then be able to use that information to your advantage, really can cause much less stress, much less headache, and really position you well going into the future. Anything else to round out?
Just ask for everything.
And
And ask again.
Yes.
Don't let no be the last word. Support your reasons for asking for certain kinds of data.
And
Like
what would you say
revenue
if
industry.
no is? We say don't let no be the last word, but sometimes there are situations where you're not going to be able to get what you want, and that doesn't just go for owner relations, but any of this. What would your suggestion be of how can a company tactfully go about getting what they need, even if they're kind of running into a brick wall in certain areas?
Well, I mean, if it's not specifically provided for in the PSA, there's really not much you can do. There are a lot of times during post-closing that you do receive information that was not in the PSA because it's reasonable, and at this point maybe you're having peer working with peer. So
Right.
it's your landman to landman, division order analyst to division order analyst, and they think, I would ask for the same thing, so I'm going to deliver it. So you really have to rely on your connections, your reputation in the industry. Is this a reasonable thing to ask? Sometimes we ask for things that aren't that reasonable, or for this particular circumstance or this particular seller, it's not reasonable for them, and you realize that, and you have to move on.
That's right. I always went back to my dad always said, and I hated every time he said it, and he would just in all walks he'd always say, you get more with honey than you do with vinegar, and that totally applied the one time that I needed information from another company, and it was because of the good reputation that I had built with them, and I was able to talk through and be able to kind of not in any way other than just by positive reputation alone be able to get the information that our company needed. And that made me really feel like the connections that we make throughout this very small but large oil industry are so vitally important. And it is things like being able to have these webinar contacts and being able to have the conferences that we are able to attend, person to person, be able to pick up the phone and call someone else kind of in your peer group, and really be able to establish those connections, because you never know when you're going to be able to call on those people again, or what companies they're going to be working for down the road. And I think all of us sitting here can say that we have seen so many of our good friends work at different companies, and then in turn be able to help us out, get us to where we need to go.
Yeah, it's all about relationships, right?
For sure.
So whether it's the negotiator, those two having a relationship and they seek out this deal, work out their terms, or lease analyst to lease analyst, their relationship within their professional organization, within their dealings, really important. And
I was just going to say, even internal relationships, right? I mean, it's so important for land administration to have that voice and input with A&D and with biz dev prior to getting to the PSA standpoint, so that whole list and inventory of requests that you want to make are in the legal document before it's signed, so you're not having to combat that later.
yeah, I think it's during acquisitions that your strategic landmen, operating landmen, and biz dev people really appreciate land administration, because they realize, oh wow, there's a lot that goes into maintaining these properties, and I don't want to do it. So I'm glad you're doing it. I was going to make a point earlier that when you can't obtain the data that you need to complete your records, it's always good to have a field on your lease record or well record, owner record, or whatever, where you can mark it as not completely verified,
Yeah.
or this could use more work, however you want to term that. Or it could even be in an Excel spreadsheet, just a kind of a list of, these are things I would like to do when we have time,
Yeah.
is to complete these leases, find these owners, what have you.
Right. I think that's really good. There's really just so much that goes into this, and I think putting a pin in this owner relations segment of as we said, request everything, make sure that you can build those relationships, and make that just with every one of our sessions. I think what we can take away, and PowerPoint will be included with this, of you can make that checklist. It's that acquisition checklist of being able to say, how can I check off each one of these? What Wade said of if we can't get one certain field, how can we come back to that, and how can we find some sort of wins there? So what we want to say is good luck with the acquisitions that you hopefully have in the future. Thank you to OCAPLTA for letting us be a part of this just wonderful little symposium. And you did it. You made it through another webinar. So that's something to be pretty happy about. So until we meet again, we're Land Information Services, and we appreciate you.